Hello, I'm Mark, and welcome to my channel. Years ago, 40 odd years ago now, I served in the Royal Navy, and I remember being on one ship, HMS Aurora, and I was out in the Gulf, and a petty officer came up to me while I was on the bridge. He said, "I've been reading this book called the Iliad." Never heard of it. And he explained what it was, and then he was very keen to say, "I think I've worked out how to pronounce some of the names." I'm not sure he actually got it correct. But anyway, the Iliad. 40 odd years later, I've started rereading it. If I remember correctly, I read it. He gave me the book, this guy. I remember the flow and the to and fro, and I found it hard going. I don't think I was ready. I was too young to take on board what is contained in here. And I believe I reread it, or tried to reread it, in the 90s. And I wasn't ready for it then. Well, it seems that I'm getting on now better than I had before. And I've got that far in, and it's where Ajax fights Hector. And it's a very interesting book. And all I can say is, thanks to this version, a lot of it, the introduction, is really good. It sets the scene, the milieu, and really what all this is about. It's about many things. There's many themes in the Iliad. But one that strikes myself, and potentially because I'm ex-military, is this concept of kleos. So the Greek world and the ancient world were obsessed with renown, martial valour. If you could do well in a battle, if you could strip a man of all his armour because you've dispatched him, I think Homer says when somebody falls on the ground, there's much clattering of their armour. Wonderful use of language. If you can grab all that, then you've gained kleos, you've gained this martial renown. And for the men of the era, that's what really all that mattered. So it was all about having a good standing in that society. And that definitely comes across. And Homer, if in fact it was one man, it may have been many, these may have been collections of the oral tradition of ancient Greece, although it wasn't known as Greece then, it was the Greek-speaking world with different city-states. They came together into one book. But the background is of men effectively trying to outdo other men and get renown. And I've often long wondered all about that, and not just with the Iliad, with other books from that era. What is it about men? And especially in this book, because I'm going to be jumping back and forth here, I do apologise. But in the book, obviously, most people will think, it's Achilles. And he is there at the very beginning, but then he falls out and you don't come across him again until much later on. He disappears. And I think that's Homer, knowing that Achilles was so well known in that world, he wanted to give prominence to other men, mainly to make a point, which I'll talk about in a moment. So if it was Achilles, he would dominate proceedings too much. And he didn't want to make it just about Achilles. So he's out of the picture for a large portion of this story. Therefore, other men come to the fore. And these men are very hot under the collar. They're quick to fly off the handle. There's this scene in a tent, Menelaus' tent, who in effect is the one in charge. He's brought more men to this siege. It's been going on for 10 years. It's been unsuccessful. But because he's brought more men, he's the one in charge. It's not whether you are higher up the kingly chain, it's how many men you've brought to bear. And so therefore he is like the first amongst equals, but he's the one in charge. And he has this spat with Achilles and Achilles with another man. And he goes off. But they're hot under the collar. They are tempestuous. They're childish, actually. And I've long wondered, why is that? Why does that come across when you're rereading, or when I'm reading the Iliad? And I think it's because The only way I can explain this is going to the 1600s in England. And what began to develop were coffee houses in London. And they were unusual because men could go there, and because they were not drinking wine and beer, they were remaining clear-headed, so they could talk business better. And therefore, a bit more maturely, a bit more considered. And it gave rise to people putting money up as an insurance for ships going off to get trade from India and so on. Lloyd's of London was a coffee house that started to do that. However, prior to that, that didn't exist. So if you wanted to drink, you wouldn't have the water. There was potentially no tea or coffee. You had to have wine or beer. Therefore, most of the time, people were sloshed. They were half-pissed. And men especially, if they're getting together and having a drink and showing off, they are going to get argumentative and very quick to fly off the handle and get upset and hold petty vendettas against each other. And I think that's why. Plus the fact they were quite young. You know, the average person in this book can't be more than their 20s and 30s. The elder men, the elder statesmen, come across as being called that. And therefore, if you're a soldier, if you're a warrior, and you're after renown, and you're young, and you're having drink, and that's all you're doing, well, it may explain some of the behaviours of some of these people, and the fact that they were willing to do what they did. So that's the first thing. The other background of this is, of course, Helen. And the thing about the women in this, they've got fabulous hair. And they're kept in the shadows, really. The women that we come across aren't with the Greeks or the Achaeans who are besieging Troy. They're in Troy. And it's quite intimate scenes between the women. And Hector, who is one of the Trojans, he has a conversation with his wife and his son. And, you know, Homer does that very well. He counterbalances the appalling atrocities being committed on the battlefield and how people were dying with this gentle, homely kind of narrative, which is, I have to say, quite unusual and must have been thought unusual at the time by the men, because all they wanted to do was knock 10 bells out of each other, get a claim, women second. And that is balanced very well. And I remember I read a play, I think it's the oldest play that we have in the Western tradition by Aeschylus, and it's called The Persians. And what's unusual about that Greek play is that it's from the perspective of the enemy who have lost a battle. And it's showing the Greek audience that the Persians, much vilified, much hated, are human just like the Greeks. And they have women at home who are lamenting the death and the loss of their husbands and mothers their sons, and this sense of calamity that they've lost. That is highly unusual, and that's what happens in the Iliad, because we don't just get it from the side of the Achaeans, the Greeks, we get it from the Trojans as well. And again, masterfully done. And you get this interweaving of people saying, look, I know I've got to go and fight. I don't necessarily want to, but I have to. And then you get this clashing of armour, people together, and how they die. And what I'm really enjoying at this point is how Homer, he doesn't just write, say, let's say a Greek hero, Menelaus, you know, he throws his spears and kills the enemy. No, he tells you how the enemy died, that the spears that were thrown probably went through the neck, went into the groin, and they went down, and night stealed over them, the clattering of armour. And you will often then give an image of, say, like a dam bursting and water flowing down a river. It's just like the men rushing forward and so on. Very poetically done. And it's not just a dry kind of retelling of a battle, which unfortunately you get quite often when it comes to military history. This is an epic, and it's done in such a way that you feel that you're there, and you get a sense of the utter futility and the loss of life. It really is. I think it's a bit like reading First World War literature, like Remarks All Quiet on the Western Front. You know, this sadness that people are dying all over a man stealing a woman. That's another thing as well. Paris, the central character there, who effectively, I wouldn't say abducted Helen, she wanted to go with him. But Hector and the Trojans see him as a curse. He's brought all this calamity on the city. So although they are prepared to defend the walls, really because of Helen and Paris, they're not exactly happy about it. So there's nuance added to the story. And that is why it's obviously considered a classic. And it is a classic. And it's also written in such a way, and I don't know whether this is because of the translator, but it's very cinematographic. It's like you're seeing a movie. Wonderfully set pieces and scenes. So it's really enjoyable. But there's one thing I really wanted to talk about, and it's not in the movie. So if you watch the movie, I think it's by Oliver Stone, Brad Pitt, there's no gods and goddesses. But they are here in the Iliad, the literature version. This. The gods and goddesses are unusual from our modern concept of gods. I think the closest that you get to it would be Indian literature, where you get men and women, Reg, who are the offspring of a human and a god or goddess getting together and having a child. That's Achilles. And the gods and goddesses are up in Mount Olympus, and they're like humans. They are humans writ large. They're just immortal. They have petty jealousies. They're always bickering. They're choosing sides. They want to get Zeus, the father, the chief god, to come down and help them. And each side counterbalances each other. So what Homer does, he shows you the way in which the gods and goddesses, mainly the goddesses, come down, and they fly down from Olympus, and they come onto the scene, and they may take the appearance of some other person on the field. And they're just like humans. There's a piece where Helen has a conversation, I think it's with Iris, if I remember correctly. Apologise if it isn't, could be Aphrodite. And she criticises the goddess, and the goddess gets upset. Now, that's not normally what we would consider gods and goddesses to be, but they are there, and they're humans writ large. And they've got this agency that humans can call on to help them. But there's this fascinating scene where one character called Diomedes, again the name of an ex-naval ship, he... my coffee. Forgive me. Diomedes is a warrior, and we follow him for quite a while in one of the chapters, and he attacks a goddess, Aphrodite. Yeah, I think it's Aphrodite, where she is trying to help the Trojans, and Diomedes attacks her and damages her hand. So a mortal can hurt a god or a goddess. And she's so pained by this that she goes up to Olympus, complains to Zeus, but it's healed. You know, she's immortal. But it's amazing that even takes place. That a simple human being, a mortal, can in fact not only converse with the gods and goddesses, but damage them. That's unusual. And what does that say? What does that tell us? That the gods and goddesses interfere with us, but we can also interfere with them. And that pretty much is the Homeric understanding of the gods on Olympus. Now, whether the average Greek at the time thought similar, or that's become part of Greek thought because of Homer, I don't know which came first. It's an interesting thing to think about. So the Iliad, I got a lot more to go through, and it's a classic. And I've said this before. I think I said it before in my introduction to YouTube, to BookTube. The classics are the classics because they survived antiquity. Not all of them are necessarily the best. They're just the ones that survived, either through willful destruction or fire, or just over time papyrus has collapsed. We've lost far more than we currently have, unfortunately. And this one has survived. It's definitely, I would say as a younger man, I struggled to get into it. Therefore, I think it's something you could potentially, I mean, somebody as a teenager would get it straight away. I didn't. But if you struggle reading it, put it down and come back in a year or two. You may have changed the way that you perceive things. And it's a good story, but it's slightly remote because they're dealing with entities that we don't. As far as I'm aware, most people don't come across Greek goddesses and goddesses anymore. Gods and goddesses. So there is something about being slightly removed from today. But what you can take from it, what I take from it, personally, is this vanity of pursuing, to get your glory, you're going to basically kill somebody else. That's a world in which, unfortunately, still exists. And if not in the corporate realm, then there are still people who will kick others on while they're going up the ladder. They say you should never kick someone going up the greasy pole because when you're falling down the greasy pole, they're going to kick you. We know about petty vendettas even today. People in power abuse that power. Well, that's what you find here in Homer and the Iliad. So this book, it's a foundation stone of Western culture. It has fantastical elements, beautifully written, and it's a human story, even with the gods and goddesses. It's a human story about what should you be fighting for, what should you defend, how should you conduct yourself when you are doing such, and even off the battlefield, that's something that should be taken into consideration. And we've never changed. This is thousands of years old. We're still doing it. This could be set in the... If you think about Shakespeare, a lot of the Shakespearean plays are updated to the modern era. Well, you could do the same with the Iliad. But where would you set it? In what war of two almost like-speaking peoples could you set this in the modern era? I can think of one place, Russia, Ukraine. They're fighting each other, and eventually, for what end? So I'm going to put that to one side for now, just my initial thoughts. I'm looking forward to the point where Achilles comes back into the story. There is the part of how women like Briseis are treated, the death of Patroclus, and so on. And I'll probably come back and do a second episode sometime in the future. Because the speed I go at, it's going to take a while to get to the 3/4 mark. But I'm enjoying it, and I do think it's well thought of for a reason. So a bit rambling, I apologise for that, but if you're still listening, if you have enjoyed this, please give us a thumbs up and subscribe, it does help. And press that button so you know when another video's come out. Until then, take care.